This week, the Passover. I've learned to not take for granted that people know certain religious holidays. Well, I guess people know Christmas and Easter. Beyond that, all bets are off. And the Passover, certainly one that probably everybody should know just from a cultural standpoint, but again, I don't take it for granted. So, if nothing else, the objective for Sunday, enlighten your kids to what the Passover was. Uh, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. There's two things. I want them to know what the Passover was and who the Passover points to. The second one, you can probably guess where we're going with that. But what is the Passover? It is the meal that the Jewish people, God's people, ate that saved them from death, or at least saved the firstborn of each family from death, firstborn animal for that matter, too. Saved the families from death, and also in the subsequent years became a meal of remembrance. So God's people would always remember how they were saved from the death of the firstborn. And in fact, to this day, Jewish people still celebrate the Passover on an annual basis. The Passover meal is still absolutely a huge part of Jewish cultural identity. Jewish families that even aren't all that observant, who even some who are atheists who happen to be of Jewish ethnic heritage, they'll still celebrate the Passover as a cultural tradition. And there's a certain script that is followed in the Passover tradition. None of this is in Exodus, but it's been added in subsequent years. The father asks the youngest son a question, why is tonight different than all other nights? And the child must answer with the correct answer. There's actually a lot. We don't have time to get into all of the interesting traditions that go with the Passover. Although, I don't know if any of you were able to come a couple of years ago when we had a guest at Zion from the organization Jews for Jesus, which is an organization that is exactly what it sounds like. Jewish people, ethnic Jews. This guy was actually from Israel, and he was visiting the United States and thinking about coming to college here. He was a real young guy, but was visiting us from Israel, and he was Jewish, but also Christian, Jews for Jesus, which actually is a minority of ethnic Jews today. But he gave a presentation at Zion that was really interesting. And a couple years down the road, we'll have somebody back from Jews for Jesus to explain how the Passover points to Christ and all of the rituals and traditions they do, and how all of that really points to Jesus. So, yeah, the story is pretty straightforward. The very last plague, Pharaoh keeps changing his mind over and over again. And finally, the firstborn of each house in Egypt is struck down, including the animals, the livestock lose their firstborn. But God's people are spared. At least we assume all of them followed the directions. If they didn't, then they weren't spared. But the directions were to have a meal, sacrifice a lamb. Well, I guess it's technically not a sacrifice because they're eating it, but kill the lamb, use the blood from the lamb, paint it on your doorposts with hyssop, and then the angel will spare your household. And that's exactly what happened. And then Pharaoh says, okay, fine, you guys finally can get out of here. On your way out, the Hebrews were given all of these gifts by the Egyptians who had viewed them favorably, so they leave the country with all kinds of gold and all kinds of jewelry. It doesn't go quite as smooth as just being able to easily leave because Pharaoh will change his mind. But we'll get into that in a little bit, but that'll be a future week. But where Christ is in the story, hopefully it's really obvious. That lamb that dies so that God's people can live. This is Jesus. The Passover meal points to Christ. He is the lamb who is slain so that his people may live. And the blood on the doorposts points to the blood Jesus shed on the cross. This doesn't necessarily require a degree in advanced theology, you would think, to recognize these elements and then how they are fulfilled in Christ. Some of the ones that might be a little harder to pick up on, the uh, the hyssop. What's going on with it? Hyssop is a plant that actually in the ancient world was used as a paintbrush because you can Google look at what a hyssop plant looked like. You can pluck one of these things off a bush and use it to paint. So it was used to apply blood to the doorpost. It was an easy way to essentially paint the blood of the lamb on the doorpost. Again, which points to the blood of Jesus on the cross. Um, Actually, on the cross, Jesus said, "I am thirsty." They gave him some vinegar with what? Wait for it. A hyssop plant. In fact, there's a psalm where David says, "Cleanse me with hyssop," and it's a psalm where David is asking for forgiveness, and he's picturing God somehow taking a hyssop plant and washing him so that he's clean and pure. So David's psalm, the hyssop used in the Passover, and Jesus is on the cross. How can this be any more obvious here? This hyssop is pointing to the fact that I will cleanse you from your sin and make it so that you do not need to fear the avenging angel, who is coming, by the way. I mean, there is going to be a day of judgment. Uh, and God is telling us, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but God is telling us in the same way that he told his people long ago, you can be saved from the coming judgment. That avenging angel is coming, and he's going to wipe out more than just the firstborn, but you can be saved with this Passover meal. Well, in our case, whom the Passover meal points to, with the blood of Christ shed on the cross, given to us actually in the Lord's Supper. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. So, where is Christ in the story? The story is absolutely about Christ. The entire Passover is pointing to how Jesus is our Passover lamb. One of the things we look for every week, where is God's mercy in the story? What does this story tell us about God and his mercies? Well, it tells us that though he is a God who sends judgment and wrath and anger, and he does wipe out sin from the face of the earth, and one day will remove all evil from the face of the earth, yet he is a merciful God who gives a way out. And for the people long ago, the Passover meal was the way out. For us, it is Christ is the way out. Also, what is the next thing we look at each week is what does the story tell us about us? Our identity as God's people. Now, one of the details you might have noticed in the Passover story, they are eating this in a hurry, right? They are eating this in a hurry. They are eating bitter herbs. They're not even taking the time to leaven the bread at all. A lot of stuff that's raw and ready to go. This is symbolic of our identity as pilgrims. They are in a hurry to leave Egypt. Egypt is not their home. Now, we might not necessarily be in a hurry to leave where we are today, but this is not our home. Let's not lose sight of the fact that we are pilgrims on a journey. This land, this world that we are living in, we are living as exiles, even as slaves, waiting for a day of redemption. And that means not getting too attached to this world, which I guess leads to the third and final thing that we look at every week. What does the story tell us about how to live as God's people, to live out that identity? Not to get too involved in this world, in the things of this world, knowing it is a temporary home. If that means you gotta go through life kind of half-dressed without cooking your food. Yeah, no, not the obvious application, but don't get too tied down to the things of this world. Recognize that you are a stranger, a visitor, an exile, even a slave while you wait for your moment of redemption. And also, the other kind of obvious application here is how to be ready when the angel comes to destroy. Eat the Passover meal. Now remember, the Passover meal for God's people in the past was a meal of salvation. It was a meal of remembrance. So the original people who first ate the meal, that was their ticket to salvation. That lamb and the blood that the lamb had spilled that was put on their doorpost was the way that they were spared. But in the years after that, it also became a meal of remembrance. Remembering salvation, remembering who their God was, remembering who they were. We have such a meal. And always kind of hard when you're teaching it to Sunday school kids because they're not confirmed yet. They're not able to eat that meal. But you know what? Tell them how important that meal will be for them one day. God is giving you a meal to eat that's going to keep you from being killed by the avenging angel who is coming. The day of judgment is coming. But those who have eaten the meal, now your kid might raise his hand and say, well, I'm not confirmed. What happens if I die before the angel comes? The problem is not if you die when you're too young to eat the Lord's Supper and drink the Lord's Supper. The problem comes when you have an opportunity to receive the Lord's Supper, this meal that God has given you for salvation, and you say, no thanks, I think I'm going to pass on that. Something else on the menu here? No, this is what God has given you. For our kids who aren't confirmed yet, you tell them to cling to their baptisms. Remember that they are baptized. Um, Tell them to come up for blessings during the Lord's Supper. And actually, those of you who have brought kids forward for the Lord's Supper know that I give baptismal blessings. If I know the kid is baptized, may God keep you in your baptismal grace. And the way we stay in our baptismal grace, for those of us who are baptized and confirmed, is to have the meal. The meal that is a meal of salvation, that gives you forgiveness of sins. And also a meal of remembrance, remembering why you get this wine, which is also the very blood of Christ, which has been shed for you so that you don't have to necessarily put blood on a doorpost. I guess that wouldn't hurt. No, don't put blood on a doorpost. Receive the Lord's Supper. That's the takeaway from this story, from these chapters of Exodus. Have the meal that God has provided for you so that you know when that angel comes, you don't have anything to fear, but rather you will have an opportunity to leave this temporary place you are sojourning and go across the river and enter into the kingdom and the land that has been prepared for you since before the foundation of the world. I think I covered all the main things that I wanted to cover in this lesson, although I'm sure I'm forgetting something. I had a great question. Someone texted me on Saturday last week. If you get any questions during the week, please make sure to text or email, call, whatever. I'd be glad to help you prepare these lessons. God bless you as you continue to live out the calling He's given to you as Sunday school teachers.